I'll pass it on to Paul to officially kick us off today.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us in a conversation about how journalists can make news coverage of working class women more community-centered. I'm Paul Chun. I'm the CEO of the Center for Public Integrity. Our mission is to use the power of journalism to expose and hold those powerful interests accountable for upholding systems of inequality. In order for us to fulfill our mission, we must first rethink how journalism must be more inclusive by being more community-centered. Also, I'm a son of a working class woman. My mom was a garment factory worker in New York's Chinatown, and I have spent many afternoons in factory doing my homework alongside while she's working. While my mom was never portrayed as a hero, she is my hero. And I just want to thank Terra Health and Iris Kroll, whom you will meet later today, for sponsoring this important conversation so that we as a community of journalists can advance journalism to be more equitable. So with that, I'm going to toss it over to my colleague, Ashley Clark, where she will introduce the panel and get the discussion going.
Thank you, Paul, for that. My name is Ashley Clark. I'm the audience engagement editor here at Public Integrity. And today we have an awesome panel of women lined up for you today, and I'm excited about the insight they'll offer. I'm just going to go around and introduce everyone, and then I'd like to let them introduce themselves and the work that they do. First, we have Dr. Rhonda Von Shea Sharp, who's the president at the Women's Institute for Science, Equity, and Race. Nafisa Ullah, who's the organizing director at Jobs with Justice, and Lang Chansey, who's the executive director at 9 to 5. And I just want to start with Dr. Sharp, if you can just, like I said, introduce your organization, the work that you do, and the women that you serve, and then we can move on to Nafisa and then Lang.
So thank you, Ashley. So first of all, let me get some formalities out of the way. I'm Rhonda, right? So I've been Rhonda longer than I've been Dr. Sharp. So please address me and anyone else. Like, I'm cool with Rhonda. I am the president and founder of the Women's Institute for Science, Equity, and Race. We are the first research think tank to focus solely on Asian, Black, Indigenous, American, multiracial, and Hispanic women. I founded WISER, which is what we're finally referred to as, because I was reading reports and I'd often see women and they wouldn't be talking about Ling, Ashley, Micah, or I, and hopefully I said your name correctly. They wouldn't be referring to us. We believe in using a microanalysis approach, which for us means disaggregating data, using the characteristics believed to influence an outcome, and hopefully I'll get a chance to talk a little bit more about that later.
And Nafisa?
Hey, happy to be here. I'm Nafisa. I'm the organizing director at National Jobs with Justice. We are, I use she and her pronouns. We're a national coalition. This is so many buzzwords, so feel free to just not get it. It's totally cool. We do campaign work, and it's all about work. It's all about workers. We're a national network, buzzwords, of local coalitions, more buzzwords, that do economic justice work. So the long and short is that there are 36 chapters across the country. Each of them is a coalition framework, meaning like you have climate activists, you have labor unions, you have, I don't know, what else do we have? Like, feels like everything is climate and worker right now, but you have, it's a coalition of multi-interested, multifaceted folks from the community trying to make change. And we're just like the national container that helps hold them. And then we also run national campaigns around economic justice work, primarily around worker voice, worker power, and worker governance.
Thank you. And Ling?
Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Ling Chansey. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the executive director here at 9 to 5, National Association of Working Women. We will be celebrating our 50th anniversary next year. So currently we are 49 years old, young. 9 to 5 is a racial and gender justice organization using economic justice as a strategy towards the liberation of all people. We work on both public policy and grassroots advocacy, really building power in communities with working women of color and their families on issues that directly impact them. So we work on a workplace justice issue. You think of issues like paid leave, paid sick days, scheduling, sexual harassment. And then we also work on family and community sustainability issues like climate justice, utility justice, housing, and childcare. And then we also work, as we talk about building power in the community, we actually have a leadership pipeline program called our Community Justice Fellowship. It's a paid internship where folks actually from the community come through our classes and learn how to become advocates for themselves and their community. So I started as a community advocate many years ago. You know, we believe that all working women live on when we all wear multiple hats. You know, mothers, we partners, we aunts, and you know, cousins and sisters and everything else in between. So, you know, we believe that those with the lived experiences, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, are experts because that is their lives and these are our lives and our experiences. So that's a little bit about what we do at 905. And I am a new immigrant. I was born and raised in Singapore. So I also have a lot of experiences doing this work, plus a lot of lived experiences as well. Thank you.
Thank you all for sharing. So I want to set up the conversation by talking about some of the harmful tropes and stereotypes that the media perpetuates, and its coverage of working women, and what does that harm do, and how does it impact the women that you serve? And feel free, either of you, to hop in and answer the question in a particular order.
I can go first, and I'm sure my co-conspirator Rhonda will have lots more to say. You know, I think the harmful stereotype of the poor women comes from the white supremacy culture and the colonist framing, right? The saver mentality of saving or rescuing the less fortunate. The narrative, you know, has adverse effect on working women, especially in communities of color. The lesser than the image portrayal is really inaccurate. It perpetuates myths like the welfare queen, you know, that help sustain racism at its core. Right, the term, you know, was popularized in the 70s and 80s during the Ronald Reagan era, and now is still, you know, it's coming back up, right? We see it in the news, Paul Ryan using it. Like, this is a dangerous narrative because it doesn't really, I mean, if you read the book and you know how that terminology came about, like it wasn't even what people think of what it is of when we talk about welfare queens today. So I think those narratives are used to wedge communities against each other, especially in communities of color, right? In Asian community, we have the model minority myth, right? We're all great, we're all doing great, you know, but then, you know, like if you talk about the issue of homelessness and you won't see lots of Asian AAPI folks out in the community acting like what we traditionally look at as homelessness. But there is, you know, this covert like homeless population of API community that we don't even talk about, right? So we have to be really careful about those kind of narrative and the language that we use because it's really harmful to our communities, right? And I think that the other thing that really you know, like when we talk about this issue is, I hear it so often, especially since I've been in America, this notion of pull yourself by the bootstrap, right? Like everybody has equal opportunity. America is a place of freedom. You know, you can dictate what kind of life you have, but we got to think about many people don't even have boots to begin with, or shoes or slippers. So how are they going to have those opportunities to pull themselves up? So I think the inequalities that, the inequities that exist in our community cannot be easily erased if you don't include those white supremacy culture that we are all socialized in.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I agree with Lang Lang, 120,000%, which is not a real number, but I 100% agree. And I think to put another point on it, it's actually what's the most harmful are the narratives that we don't see and we just take for granted and then hold up, right? And so the bootstrap narrative is one of them. And the way that we see them in the media a lot is just by centering one person's story of how they overcame something bad. Like, let's imagine a worker in the kind of work that I do. Like, okay, there's a worker in a poultry facility. It's shit. It's the worst possible place to work. It's disgusting. It's unsafe. There's sexual harassment. It's horrible on the line. And she manages somehow to like make some kind of change at work, get a raise, make a safer condition, get that guy fired. But the story will be told as if she did all this stuff out of her bravery and all this, like, and that's great. Like, she is a fucking hero, and we should talk about her being a badass hero. And we should talk about the structures that allowed that to happen, that are actually invisible. Like the invisible, like, this is normal. This isn't an exception to the industry. This is an exception to this workplace. And also that in order to make those changes, this person had to come up against all of the actual unspoken narratives. One, that she should be able to do it by herself. Two, that the system is set up in a way that's fair if she just fights hard enough. And then three, that it's over, that she won and everything is better now. And these aren't fun narratives to like tell, right? Like the arc of triumph isn't one that you're going to see in the narratives that we want to build up. But I think for the first step is to visibilize what we're saying invisibly, which is that we still have this ethos of like, that you can pull yourself up by the bootstraps, that there is some kind of attainable solution that we can reach through individual action, in terms of our own, like, the word, self-determination, in terms of our own self-determination, which is not true. It's fundamentally not true that we have that kind of agency and power as individuals. We need structural changes, and we need to tell the stories of how collective workers, collective groups of people are pushing for structural changes. When we take that out of context and just talk about one worker's fight, it's not just disingenuous, it's also like it upholds all the narratives that Lang Lang was talking about, when we isolate. And that's just one of the pieces. I also have a whole thing about how you should talk about that badass woman who's standing up, which is, sometimes I get a little bit animated, so I'll shut up for a little while.
And so I want to add just a little bit to both of what's being said. And part of it for me is sometimes less about the narrative itself as opposed to the words used in the narrative. So if we're talking about the badass worker, that we actually identify her, and if she happens to be non-white, she's not referred to as a woman of color, because that's loaded with erasure, and you really don't get a chance to see who she is and what are some of the invisible structures that she's fighting against. So I think it's really important that we name who we are talking about. And then with respect to what Lang Lang has said about the poverty narrative, we are doing some work with an organization and really being mindful of that poverty narrative, again, is not one that's universal. So what poverty looks like in urban spaces is not the same poverty in a rural space. And to talk about poverty as if people experience it as a monolith is problematic. I don't normally post too much on LinkedIn, but yesterday I posted, and I think I tagged Ling Ling because I've been having this conversation with people. Like, everybody's super excited right now. Like, the numbers around poverty are coming out, and there's a conversation about how the child's tax credit has reduced poverty. But look, let's be realistic. If you're a penny above poverty, these studies will say you're no longer in poverty. But there is a huge difference, and I'm a data, like, I'm gonna die. Data is probably gonna be the death of me. So I'm all about the data. But I am also learning to put that in context and for us to be critical about what that data is saying. And so when you see that poverty numbers have gone down, the real question is, did the lived experience in poverty actually change? Because a penny probably didn't move someone out of an impoverished neighborhood. And so for me, it's not necessarily so much the narratives, it's the words in which we use to describe there. Is there erasure? Are you assuming monolith? Are you ignoring conversations around Asian poverty because you're upholding this narrative of being a model minority? And as all of us are advocating for policy change. So when that is not spoken about correctly, and we don't have the media going in and being critical about what's being said, and then putting the mic in front of people who are going to be critical about it, I don't think you really can encourage people to craft policies that are going to be effective.
Thank you all. As we talk about some of the harm and the mistrust that I think media and journalists have created between communities they cover in their newsrooms, I sort of want to talk about what does a more sustainable and equitable relationship look like between media outlets and communities that they're working in. What can journalists do to really understand the people that they're covering?
I'm going to jump in on this one because this is the one that's been annoying me as of recently. I think the most disheartening part for me is for a journalist to call me, ask me questions, and let me be clear, I absolutely understand that there is a focus on what you're writing about. But if we're thinking about all the things all of us have just said, being critical about what you're writing about and who you're centering, and we are critical, and then I look at the article and my comments didn't make it, right? There's an aspect of that sort of feels like you just wasted my time. If you really, or if you're looking for a particular voice, then you should go find that voice, right? But if you really want a full coverage of what's happening and how people should be thinking about it, and asking your readers to be critical thinkers and arming them to be advocates for change, then you really need to think about providing, putting in the voice that isn't being heard, right? And for me, that's the most disheartening part, is that you'll call us and then you don't advocate for our comments to be included in the story. I think when you do that, it makes us not willing to want to talk to you again, because we don't see our comments showing up, so it feels like a waste of our time.
Yeah, I can't relate to, and I am going to call you Dr. Sharp on principle. Going to call you Dr. Sharp. I do agree with Dr. Sharp about. I don't share the position of people coming to me a lot for asking for my opinion, which is a whole. But I do share the who gets quoted matters, and the time it takes to provide good analysis is shouldn't be invisibilized. With the workers that I spend the most time with, the thing that's the most frustrating, what I've heard actually time and time again, especially through the last couple of years, is they're tired of being portrayed as victims. They're tired of having to come and bear their stories for the press so that there's so that one point can be made about one industry, one employer, one specific policy thing. And the way they're portrayed is oh, this poor single mom, again, like Dr. Sharp said, no race attributed, unless, I don't know, who knows, lots of variables left out, who's having this really tough time under COVID, these sob stories that just don't reflect the way people actually view themselves. And it's sad, it's a harm for sure, but it also undercuts the organizing work, where we're working so incredibly hard for people to feel empowered in their stories, to take the pain that they're experiencing and collectivize it with others who are experiencing the same thing and turn it into power. And if the stories that they are being asked to tell don't match that arc, it hurts. Like it's hard to overcome. The other thing that's that would be awesome to see a shift in is that when workers are ready to talk about their experiences, especially if they're in an active campaign, they want to include their demands. They want to be able to articulate what they think the solutions are. And when they don't see those solutions in the articles, they feel real tokenized. Like, oh, you wanted to do some like disaster voyeurism here, but you didn't want to hear what I had to say. You didn't want to tell people what I wanted to solve. And so those are kind of the two big things I would shift immediately if I could, is anything that portrays our folks as victims and not agents of their own power. And then the other is to always include their demand, even if you just say it as they think that they should do this. Like they're working on a project for Y. Some of them are activists for this policy. Like it can really just be 6 words, but including the demand is critical.
Yes, and ditto, ditto, ditto on everything that has already been said. I'm just like nodding my head, like, and you know, I think one of the things that I reflect a lot upon when we're talking about journalism and talking to journalists is really be intentional, right? I don't know what drives everybody, but I think that, you know, coming as journalists and doing investigative reporting and doing reporting on subject matters that impact every, you know, basic human lives every day, you know, I would really think about, you know, what the intention is when you're writing a piece, you know, just like Rhonda, you know, I get calls all the time, and sometimes I make it into the article, but at the same time it's disheartening because most of the time it's like, it's not even the most important point that I'm trying to put across, but it just sounded like probably the best sound bite or whatever you call it that made it into the article, right? And it doesn't talk about the other issues and the other implications of what the subject matter is at hand. So to me, that's often very disappointing, right? And it's often like, just give us, you know, come into our community for that one-off story, you know, like what is that success or hero or whatever story that you're looking for. And that shows to me that is very surface level and is not really intentional about what you're really trying to get to the heart of the matter is. And I think that, you know, just like the current newspaper you pick up and every other newspaper is talking about the death of the Queen. Like, yes, I get it. It's important. The Queen passed away, but there are still issues that impact us daily. We're still having these daily experiences and issues at hand, but everybody is focused on, like, I don't know what you call it in media, the soundbite of the day. So, you know, how is journalism really going to help, you know, come into our communities to get those stories where it's more than just the story of the day?
Thank you all. Something that I'd like to talk a lot about in journalism is shifting who we think of as experts, right? And I think some of you have already touched on this. We see it, and especially in the past few years, time and time again, journalists rely on things like police narratives, right? And they take it for face value. They're the experts on what happened in the situation, and they get it wrong, right? And I just want to like talk about the importance of shifting who we think of as journalists when we say, you know, we want an expert on poverty, we want an expert on workers' rights, and we're going to someone who's maybe in academia or someone who is working for some sort of think tank who has never maybe experienced poverty themselves. What can we do when we start to say that the people with lived experiences are the experts?
Someone jump in here again, because this was part of why I don't like being addressed as Dr. Sharp in a panel like this, right? Because the assumption for some people is because I am Dr. Sharp, I am the expert. I am not. Now, I'm the expert if you're talking about data in theory. I'm your girl every day, mostly all day. But if you're talking about lived experiences, I am not the expert, right? And I think it is important for journalists, as Ling Ling said earlier, about intentionality. What are you looking for? Are you looking for a voice that is going to provide, here is what the data says, here is how it fits in economic, social, psychological, political theory? Then you should be talking to, I think I'd written in my notes, you need to be talking to a PhD. But if you're looking for people, and maybe sometimes a JD, if you're looking for who's doing the work and how everything that we've been taught in class, whether or not that is the reality, then you need to be talking to an ED or a program manager, because they're the folks who are in the, they're the people on the street doing the work. We are not. So I think it is intentional to be, you need to be intentional about what perspective that you're looking for. And so Nafisa, I saw you laughing, but I'm mindful of that, because I know that when the people say Dr. Sharp, I'm assumed to be the expert. On this panel, I'm only if it's data and theory. I am not the expert on anything that is about community activism and work, not my space.
I mean, I won't get in a back and forth with you about how I think that it's okay to give you, like, who gets credit and it gets assumed to be an expert is another thing too. And so giving you more benefit of the doubt on what your expertise, like, I'm comfortable with that. I'm comfortable with you taking up more space, like, but that's my own choice. In terms of workers, like, about people with lived experience being the experts, this one is a little bit complicated for me. I'm not gonna lie, because on the one hand, of course, the folks, like impacted folks, are the experts of their lived conditions. They're the experts of what the solutions are and what's accessible to them and not accessible to them, what solutions are working and what solutions are not working. And yet they don't necessarily have the capacity, energy, or drive to be the vehicles for those stories. So one thing that's tricky is how do we build that bridge between the expertise and the exhaustion of being, like, it's work, y'all. It is work to talk to press. It's not something that comes naturally to folks. Like, I'm an organizing director and I still hate it. Like, I refuse at least 3 times before I say yes to any press thing. And I'm, like, yes, I'm queer and I'm brown and I'm Muslim and I grew up in Wyoming and, like, I have all this imposter syndrome and fine, but I still, like, have a title and a position and I talk all the time. It's work to talk to press, and it takes, like, a lot of intentional prep that organizers do to make sure folks have the skills and the confidence. And I wonder if one intervention is trying to make it more accessible, like trying to make reporters more of organizers, like easier folks to talk to, so that your conversations feel more accessible and genuine. When you're talking to experts about data, you come with a particular understanding of what you think that data says. You come with a set of skills you've prepped to be able to speak articulately to this expert. Do the same with workers. Come prepped with how you want to bring yourself to be relatable to this worker. Come prepped, ready to hear between the lines of what they're saying and ask those probing questions, and really value the expertise that they're bringing. They're not necessarily going to speak to you in the same way a different expert is going to speak to you. So do the prep you would do for that same other expert. That's my offering there.
I think, I love this question because I think Rhonda and I, have a lot of discussion around this issue, right? And I think the definition of experts is multifold, right? Just like Nafisa said, like, it depends on what kind of information you're looking for and who do you go to, in the term of who are classified experts. I think, it's tricky because at the same time, we have to be really intentional about also owning the fact that we are socialized in a world where classism plays a huge problem in how we define experts, right? When I was a young mother, I was making $7.21 an hour at my job, and my childcare was $150 a week. So I barely made enough money to pay for childcare with a little extra money to put on the table for rent, including, and then my partner's income to pay for food and everything, and rent and everything else in between. You know, the first year when we were together, we made $1,000 above the poverty line. And that was without a child, $1,000 above the poverty line. And then the second year we had a child. And so, you know, like, I didn't need an economist to tell me how unaffordable childcare was. You know, like, I knew how unaffordable childcare was because I lived through it. And then 2.5 years later, when I had my second child, childcare was $330 a week. And I was making about $30,000 a year. So, and that is that is gross income, $30,000 gross income. So if you think after all the taxes, you know, like, again, I had barely enough money to pay for childcare and, you know, a little bit of money for groceries. So I think, you know, we have to just be real careful when we talk about who the experts are and how in media, how it's portrayed, right? Again, you know, there are different levels of expertise, but I think that it's dangerous when we don't take all those things into consideration, especially in the news article, right? And how, you know, again, you know, talking about the coming into our community and looking for that one success story or one, you know, story of impact. You know, we have to be really intentional about, you know, how we are being portrayed.
Yeah, Ling, something you just said gave me another thought, which is that the victimization thing and the expert thing are fully related, right? Like, if you're portraying someone as things are happening to them and they're the object of actions happening to them and they're not agents, how could you possibly portray them as an expert at the same time? It's it's a symbiotic thing. And so you can't, you really cannot do the victim thing and then try to lift them up as an expert. You have to center their expertise first, and that then by itself the victim thing will fall away. That's smart, Ling. You're smart.
Thank you all for that. So we've talked about the narratives that are being pushed and things that we should maybe stay away from, or how we reframe. And I think, Nafisa, you touched on this earlier about like some of the stories that are invisible. And Rhonda, you talked about some of the erasure that we see when we lump people together and don't use specific language. Can we talk a little bit more about what are the stories that we're missing, right? Who are journalists ignoring? And how does language that we use play a role in that?
Okay, so I would like someone to go. Okay, so I mentioned a little bit about the being critical about this poverty conversation and moving it from the data to a conversation that is about the experience of poverty. I think that is one. I'm just going to say, just very broadly, I think for me, the biggest part of the conversation that we're missing is centered on the disaggregation of data. So I'm looking at stuff and we're still talking about COVID, yet you really don't know who's dying from COVID, right? I can tell you women, I can tell you age, I can tell you race, but I cannot tell you at that intersection of race and gender and age. And I worry that we have lost a generation of grandparents. Right? So the study has come out and talked about the number of children who have been orphaned. But I worry that there's a whole generation who are going to grow up and they're not going to have grandparents because, you know, the 50, 60, and we already know the silver generation was pretty much, you know, like they have been the hardest hit. I think when we are not asking people to disaggregate that data, to be intentional about who are you talking about, when we allow folks to say women of color, when we allow people to use words like disproportionate, which really, really digs at my craw, because I find that disproportionate is only used in reference to Black and Hispanics, right? And it's negative. Everybody else gets to be overrepresented, right? It's not negative. So I think for me, like what we're missing in the conversation is not any one thing. It's bringing a critical voice to whatever the topic is. When I taught stats, I used to ask my students, I would say, you read the story. So tell me who the story is directed at, right? So who are they trying to influence? And then who's been left out? I think that's the biggest thing that we can do blanket wise. When you're going in and you're asking a question, for you to be critical and ask yourself, who have I left out? Because that's the other side of the story. And I'm not sure that it's any one thing as much as it is asking people to be critical and drill down on the data for the nuances and not to assume a monolithic experience.
Thank you, Rhonda. And that's why Rhonda and I are friends, because I love the way she thinks and the things that, that she's just like pulling out and talking about data and how that really matters. I think one of the things that, this COVID experience, this pandemic has shown so many of us doing the social justice work is, a moment, as I can only speak for myself, many moments in this 2-year time period, I had a lot of moments of like disappointment in the media because, all of a sudden, because of this pandemic, there are so many stories about how, women, predominantly when they report on is white women's stories about, oh, childcare now is a problem because I'm working from home and nobody, my kids are running around, during our Zoom conversation and all of this. And I'm like, what is wrong with our fucking world? Childcare affordability and access has always been a problem, but all of a sudden now it's like a grandiose heightened like issue because now middle working class people are also experiencing this stress. But it has always been here, right? It's not a new problem, but all of a sudden we are paying so much attention to it, but without, again, talking about the lived experience of those that were already experiencing this struggle way long before the pandemic hit, right? So really being careful about like what that is in the media portrayal, right? And talking about like utility crisis that, people are an eviction crisis during the pandemic. I'm like, we are fighting evictions cases every fucking day. So why is all of a sudden, again, this is an issue, right? All of a sudden it's big news. So really trying to be intentional about, issues that are happening every day that are already here and not here just because of the pandemic. I think that is one moment in the last 2 years that has really like, given me moments of pause to say that, okay, am I going to give up on the media right now or keep reading what's going on?
Yeah, this is hard because I just agree with, I don't know, maybe we should have next panel, we should have a plant, someone that disagrees and like have a fight. But no, of course I agree with all of these things. And it just is, my mind is just going in all these directions. Like originally what I was going to say is that the story that's missing in it, especially around worker stuff, is all of the work that goes into being being a worker activist. Like I do want to read the story about the mom who like does their shift at Amazon and then like picks up their kid from childcare, which is completely unaffordable and insane. And then it was a crazy situation at childcare, probably full of comedy and dirty diapers. And then comes back to the warehouse to do organizing work, what it's like there, goes home, makes dinner, but like, I want to hear the reality of what it's not just like, I talked to my coworkers one time and then we filed a petition to organize. Like, of course, because of the moment that we're in, I want to hear those like deep, deep stories. But I think hearing Rhonda and Ling Ling, maybe Dr. Rhonda will be my compromise. Hearing Dr. Rhonda and Ling Ling talk has reminded me that one thing I would love also for our whole movement is that we're so good at talking about the problems that it would be awesome if the media helped us carry our vision for what we want to be different. Where like, when we're talking about this badass woman who's like doing this organizing work at Amazon and picks up her kid and does all this, that we also talk about what it could look like if workers did, like if childcare was affordable, if workers had a voice at work at Amazon, if there was a share, like if we could start planting the seed about what the world could be, because the narrative is like the invisible narrative behind us that's all around us all the time is about losing, is about like how we're wrong and we can't win. Like any pieces that you can add to help us paint where we're trying to go helps, because that's not, I mean, speaking of experts, I am not an expert in telling you how, like telling a story. I can't do that. So it's part of why I can't articulate where we want to go, is because we're fighting so hard just to be alive.
I just wanted to jump in a little bit on what Nafisa said about providing solutions, and this piggybacks on what Ling Ling said earlier about class. I think in order for people to actually hear and report your solution, and this is really, I think, is a way that journalists can help, is that they have to think that you're actually worthy of those solutions. And I think when we're talking about a lot of issues around class, there is implicit in that is that you don't deserve. There are things that you do not deserve. So Nafisa, I would wonder if that's a huge part about why we don't see the solutions, right? Because then I am, as a reporter, and not directed at anyone, but just saying in general, right? That you're co-signing that these folks are worthy of this solution. If we, think about the situation with Amtrak or any strike, when it's a large strike in a union, you hear them talk about the workers' demands. Right? Like that's part of the conversation so that the public largely understands why this is going on. And generally people are like, well, of course they deserve good wages and of course they deserve not to go to work, right? But they are generally unioned in a particular space. You add class to that, and there are certain things that you don't get. In the pandemic, people talked about essential workers, and Iris is where I met Iris, was on a Economic Policy Institute webinar, and I brought to people's attention that they weren't essential. The jobs are, the people are not, right? Because of the working conditions. And I think we forget that, the way class plays into not just who we think deserves childcare conversation seems to always be quality. Put their child in a place that is not of good quality. Like, why is that even a conversation? I don't even have kids. And I hear that conversation and go, why do they always put quality childcare together? I don't get that. Like, I would drop my kid off someplace where they're not going to be safe. So I say that to say that I think that class plays a huge part in terms of quality childcare and solutions.
Rhonda, this is a afterwards conversation, but don't even get me started on quality on childcare.
Okay, I have a final question before I turn it over to the audience. I know there are some questions in the chat, so I want to make sure we have time to get to those. My final question, and maybe you guys don't have an answer for it, maybe you do, is who's getting it right? What are some coverage that you've seen that's really empowering to the women that you serve, right? What impact have you seen it have on you personally, or on the work that you do, or how you think about the work that you do? You can name specific examples if you'd like. If you don't remember a specific example, but you have an idea of what the coverage looked like, please share that.
So I don't have an example of a coverage, but I do want to share a story. about 2 years ago, an editor from Bloomberg reached out to me to write. Okay, so this is gonna tell y'all a lot about me. Dude sent me the email. I responded back. I was like, hey, Mark. I'm sorry. I was like, hey, Mike, thanks for reaching out. His name was Mark, but who else would be emailing me from Bloomberg but Mike, right? Mike Bloomberg is going to email me to ask me about speaking. So when I wrote him back to apologize, what he said to me was, if you write opinion pieces that cause our audience to change the way they think, you can call me whatever you want. And that really resonated with me, that here was somebody who was reaching out to me to write because the expectation was I was going to be pushing against the grain. So I don't have an example of a reporter, but that experience, and I'm not even sure that we even think sometimes about Bloomberg in that way. But my editor's name is Mark Whitehouse. So if anybody knows him, please tell him again, I'm singing his praises. I don't write for him often, but let him know that I am singing his praises. And that resonated with me because what it said to me was he recognized there was a space, right? Or there was a voice that was missing and that voice could potentially be mine. I thought that that was a great response, right? I'm about getting my readers to change the way they think. And if you do that, we're good.
I feel like you probably know what I'm going to say, which is that if the experience of talking to you is a good one for the worker, it's a good one for me. Meaning exactly what you imagine, right? Like I already told you to do the prep so that they feel like experts, treat them like experts, and hear them like experts, and then report it like experts, like they're experts, and then we're good to go. Fairly recently in November, oh God, not recently at all. This shows how backed up I am on my reading. I have a 1-year-old. We subscribe to the New Yorker, and there's just like a pile that I'm like every weekend trying to get through. So I thought this was more recent. It's from November. It was good. It was a New Yorker piece about resilience force workers. And I'm a little bit biased because I've worked with Socket and this whole group of workers myself, and I'm a big fan. But what was compelling to me about the story, yeah, and I don't know Sarah. I don't know this Sarah person. But what was compelling to me is just the fullness of both the complexity of organizing, the ongoingness of it, the power and the challenge that the workers are feeling, and then like the stuckness of the system, like where you can win, get air, be excited, but then get sucked back in because this is the world it is. Like we can't alter it immediately, and it just communicated all of this depth in a way that I hadn't felt in a really long time. That being said, this was an investigative New Yorker piece that's like 1 million pages long, right? Like I understand that this isn't how all journalism can be. Their pieces need to be shorter than this to be read. And you can't devote 6 months of your life to each story. So I don't know, it's hard for me to offer what good ones are that are more common. And I think that's exactly the conundrum, is like, I don't know how to tell the complexity of the stories that are required of this moment, and honestly have been required for all time, but really in this moment, we simply can't do it in sound bites and TikToks and short pieces. Like we can't. So I'm sorry, I don't have anything to offer.
Yeah, I think I don't really have, specific samples to say who is doing it best. What I find that is most interesting, most like in line with how I would think media reporting should look like articles that are like where the reporter has spent a lot of time in the community, right? Coming to us, but not just us, but like asking community organizers, like really spending some time on the ground to figure out what are the stories that is really important? What is that storyline that is important, right? So I think a few years ago, this was before everything blew up over Roe v. Wade, but there was a journalist that actually came into our communities and did a whole reporting. And I think this was in, is it Cosmopolitan? I can't remember, but it was big news, or the New Yorker actually, on abortion, what do you call that? Abortion fund providers, right? And it was really nice. The write-up was great because they really spent a substantial amount on the ground, really visiting the clinics and talking to folks, right? I think those kind of reporting, it's good, but again, you know, it's like, I'm sure, you know, most journalists don't have that luxury of spending like 6 months. Again, what Naifa has said, that spending 6 months, you know, in on the ground doing one reporting, right? So what is that happy medium? I think that is what is the sweet sauce? I don't have an answer, but I would like to see more responsible reporting.
So, Nafisa, I'm going to do what you asked. I'm going to push back a little bit. And that is, I would really like for us not to have these conversations in this moment, because I think, you know, what worries me, and I've often said this about COVID, because people are like, oh my God, COVID, COVID, COVID. And it's like, look, my example is, you know, when you're part of a group and you get the solo or you get the spotlight, right? Like you get that moment. And I feel like what COVID did was put spotlights on stuff. But anybody who's ever been the dancer or played in a band and you get your solo moment, you're still playing even when the spotlight isn't on you. So I worry that when we frame stuff in these moments, and we're already seeing a little bit about this, right? Like the ways in which stuff is opening up and there are inequalities that are again fading to the background. I worry when we make it about this moment, because it's not a movement, it is a moment, that we're going to give people permission to relax, right? When the pandemic is over, if ever, right? People are going to fall back and relax. I heard someone on NPR said, one of the things that he doesn't like about the term resilience is that when you talk about people being resilient, you make whatever they're going through seem so normal. Right? Like, because it's like, of course you're resilient, right? Like, but who is it? Who doesn't have some resilience? And more importantly, I often see that that's a conversation again in communities that aren't white, that we talk about the resilience that folks have. And so I would just ask that we really think not about this moment. I think all of us on this panel would agree that what we're asking you to do is a long-term shift, not one that's about this moment. We're asking you to do this in the work that you do henceforth.
Fair enough. I agree with those things. I can get sharper. I think what I was saying about this moment is that it's impossible to articulate the complexity of in short form. And I think it's also fair to say that there is no moment that can be fairly articulated in terms of the complexity and context and nuance that's necessary at any given moment. But I do feel that there is an urgency now. I mean, we're slipping into fascism, right? Like there is a particular urgency that feels critical to articulate the nuance and complexity, which, yeah, I appreciate Erica translating my original, like my previous thought into an ask for these experts in media, which is, how do you, given the existing format of media, of the majority of media, actually try to communicate the complexities, nuance that are required, given the constraints? And is there a way, and what can we do as the organizers, of the folks in the field, to help push those constraints to be actually fit to purpose for what we're trying to do? Ongoing, not just for the moment.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. One other thing in terms of that. I know when folks interview me and my comments end up on the floor, like the editing floor, you know, like in the video, I know what I would really appreciate if someone asked me, hey, Rhonda, if you've given me a lot of good stuff, if I had to take one thing, is there's one point you want me to include, what would that be? I think that allows me to say to you, yeah, we've had a conversation, it's been great. And I hear you saying to me, I recognize that all of this I can't put in. And rather than me come through and pick a soundbite, what do you really want my readers to know about this story, the work that you do? I think that would just, then at least okay, but I will say then I'd have the expectation that you're really going to do that because you've asked me and that you're going to figure out how to work that into your study, into your story, sorry. I feel like that makes me feel more like you're talking to me because you really want to get my voice out there, right? And the way that I think.
I think that's a really good advice that I always try to advocate for, is like a level of transparency when you're talking to sources about what you're looking for, how you're framing the story, and what parts of their, of the interview or the conversation could be or could not be included in the final product. That is a really solid piece of advice. So thank you for that, Rhonda.
I'll also say sometimes folks call me and I'm right out the gate, like, that's great, but this is what you should be thinking about. And so generally I know when I'm like, this is what you should be thinking about. Yeah, they're probably not going to take any of my comments, but I do that often because I do think that that what reporters are talking to me about, as we've said here, is not the real story that they should be thinking about.
Excellent. All right, well, there's a very robust conversation happening in the chat. So I'd like to turn it over to the audience members to ask questions. The first question that I see that was pointed out to me was from Jamie Frazier. Jamie, and hopefully, and tell me if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, I can read the question, or you can feel free to come off of mute and read your question yourself.
Sure. So I think the question I'd asked was, how do you best weave together the personal lived experience expertise with the kind of data findings that someone like Rhonda can share? Because I think often our stories like lean on the personal narrative a lot or focus on the data, but how can they be complementary?
I gave her a response, and my response was, I think that if you're talking to, so if someone called me about poverty issues, I am going to refer them to Ling Ling or someone else that I'm doing some work with, right? Because I know that the work that I do aligns with the work that she does, and I know her, right? So I know that when you go to talk to her, and if I said to them, hey, say Rhonda recommended that I chat with you, I know that when you get references in that way and people know about each other's work, then for as much as maybe is not needed, but it is helpful to help us put us at ease, then there's some credibility in your talking to Ling Ling, and Ling Ling knows I'm not sending somebody her way that I've just had a real bad experience with, right? Like not going to happen. So I think that when you're talking to, whether it's the data person or the person who's doing the work, to ask them if they have a recommendation for someone that you should be looking at, because I think that'll give you some idea about the level of respect and connectedness the two people have.
This is actually something I've seen done really well once in a while, and I'll try to find an example and send it to Ashley, where like a really interesting, like just whatever, 2 weeks ago, Gallup came out with more polls about workers being interested in organizing. And it's really not terribly difficult to find workers who can speak to, like, they can add depth to that data with their own stories. And so the question that's worth asking, so like, I think layering those things is natural. And I think all of you probably are really, really good at it. Now the question is like, which stories do you pull out or which do you center? Do you center the worker story? Or do you center the data? which pieces of the data are you going to pull out and try it? Like those are the ones that are more complex and to me, where the rubber hits the road. And then like, I always love when, particularly when reporters they'll, again, I'm not a storyteller, but when you tell the story of what's there, but like Dr. Rhonda says, the story of what's not there or what's not being said, as soon as you visibilize it, it like creates a whole universe of possibility. And I think that's critical. So if it was me, data tells this story. Here's a worker to provide depth and individual, like, if you want to call it color. I'm not cool with that, but like, that's probably colloquially the most easy thing to say. So data, worker story to provide depth. And then like, well, what doesn't the data say? Where is there a gap? What are like all the questions that Dr. Rhonda has asked us earlier about what it's not saying, who it's overrepresenting, underrepresenting, and not like, then like leave us readers with some questions. And I think that's to me the best type of reporting that I get to see is ones that don't take me, like, we're a surprisingly smart constituency in the world now, despite the way we all behave. And we don't need to be taken from A to Z any longer. It's kind of crazy.
I'd also say, depending on who you want to center, you can also flip that. So you could start with Nafisa and go, this is what we're consistently hearing is happening in the field. Are you seeing, does this align with the data? Because I'll tell you, I mean, the reality is for most of us who are using these large data sets, it's a sample, right? It's a sample of data that the census is going out and gathering for us. And we may not have the people that she's talking about in our sample taking the survey, right? So it does, I guess I'm suggesting you can also center the worker and then come to someone and say, is this what your data is showing? And I would like to think if the person who analyzes data is a critical thinker about their data, they're going to acknowledge, no, this isn't what I'm seeing in the data, but here may be why. My sample is representative, right? And so they may not be picking up all of these workers. But I think it's important for folks to know that that the data doesn't always tell the full story because it is representative.
Yeah, I would just add that I don't think it's one or the other. I think we have to just remember that, you know, to have comprehensive reporting and also to be really analytical in our reporting is the fact that you have to have both. Right. It's like me writing a testimony, getting ready to testify at the Capitol, right? It's like, I gotta have all the elements, like I gotta have the signs down. If I'm talking specifically, if I'm speaking to the committee for FDA, I gotta have the signs, but I also have to have the stories of the people that will be impacted by this piece of specific legislation or, you know, the approval of this medication, right? Like it has to have all the different elements to have a full story and not one or the other. But I think it's and.
Thank you. And thank you for that question. Paul, it looks like you have a question, so I want you to ask it.
Yeah. So my question is, do you think that, you know, maybe who does a better job, like this sort of community media, like the Black press or the Chinese press, or even local mainstream, do they do a better job than national news, or we all just kind of not that great all around in covering working class women?
I mean, no, nothing's a monolith, right? Like, not like, again, let's disaggregate this data too, Paul. Like, there are better and worse national media outlets, and there are better and worse local outlets. As a general rule, right? Like, local folks are under less and more constraints to tell the story that they need to tell. Understaffed, under budgeted, tight deadline, like there's the restraints that independent media are facing are really like they're a different ball game. And yet they do seem more skilled, at least speaking to our people, to my people. And they're more embedded in the community. They understand the context that we're working with, and it's easier to visibilize the invisible narratives because they're already supposed to, like, this is the challenge. The freedom provided by being able to speak for a certain constituency means that you're already saying, well, there's a constituency, there's an audience that I intend to be talking to. It visibilizes that and it allows for a little bit more freedom. But again, there are good and bad. Like, I think there are some real garbage Asian press out there too. Like, there's some nonsense going on, and there's some awesome stuff going on.
I don't know if I agree, Nafisa, and it's not like, you know, who's doing it best or who is doing it worse. I just wonder, and this is not an answer, but a wonder if, like, in the journalist world, like, are there connections with, like, folks that are writing more on a national platform with folks that writing more from a community-based platform, you know, and how those relationships can be nurtured so that if there were stories that are in specific communities, now you have that connection and not folks just helicoptering in to the ground. I'm just wondering, I don't know what the medium or association or whatever you have, you know, the makeup is, but I just wonder if there is, like, you know, more opportunities for those cross-bonding and mentoring to happen.
I'm glad you said that, Ling Ling. A big part of what my job is actually at CPI is to help bridge those gaps. And correct me if I'm wrong about what I think you're saying is the relationships and collaborations between large or national outlets and, like, smaller or local outlets, right? That there has to be a symbiotic relationship between the two. We can't, like you said, just helicopter and think we're going to get the story right. There are people who are in those communities, already reporting in those communities, who are doing a good job. And like Nafisa said, a lot of the times who are under-resourced, understaffed, but still still have to, like, do the work. So yeah, that it is happening. I don't know, I can't speak to other organizations, but I know in the role that I have, and just personally, I know that's in order for journalism to survive and to be better and to grow, we need to be doing more of that collaboration.
And I just wanted to chime in to say, I don't know if that I didn't say to the audiences is that I'm an economist, right? So I function as an economist. I'd say I don't get calls from local spaces. When I get calls, it's the larger newspapers, and I really would encourage. I like to say things and sort of take them back. So I'm gonna say this, and then I'm probably gonna take it back. I would encourage you to reach out to your local economists and your public policy folks for comments, because generally I'm not asked. I was gonna put earlier, I live in the Commonwealth of Virginia, right? Acknowledging that we were a colony. I don't get reached out. We've got Black press here. They don't call me to ask me questions, right? I get more national exposure, not local. So I would encourage people to reach out to their local, especially I think some of your local academics. It's a plus for them to be quoted locally.
We have a question in the chat from Michelle. Michelle, feel free to come off mute, and if not, if you'd like me to read it, I can do it so as well.
So Michelle, my question to you, is there a particular Latina that you're looking for? Because I often find that Afro-Latinos are not necessarily part of that. There is a professor at John Jay College named, and then she's a professor, but she has done the work, named Michelle Holder. And if you give me a minute, I will find her book. And Michelle's book is looking at more broadly Afro-Latinas, and she does this work with a guy named Alan Aha, who I think is at Brooklyn College. So Michelle might be a person who has access to the data side, right? What the data says about Latinas in the workforce. And I was specific about that because one of the things we talk about at Weiser is who's put forward as Latina. And they are usually what people refer to as white passing, not necessarily folks that we think of being more indigenous looking. And it is rare that you are going to see somebody who is at that intersection of Black and being Hispanic or Latina.
Thank you for that. I don't know if you want me to reiterate the question at this point. Sorry, it took me a minute to get on camera. But basically, I was interested in hearing from the panel about how newsrooms that may not have a Latina on staff, may not have a Spanish-speaking Latina on staff, can connect with Spanish-speaking women in the workforce. The stat I point out is, they're the second largest group of women in the working class labor force. Obviously, not all Latinas necessarily are not English dominant, but many are more comfortable speaking in Spanish. So if you're a newsroom that doesn't have a Spanish speaker, could you all offer some guidance on connecting with that community?
Totally. So the first thing I offer is, like, obviously try to get more Spanish speakers on staff. That's a given. But second is, at the least, have an interpretation service on retainer, because there are lots and they're fantastic and they're awesome, and they will help bridge the gap, not just between monolingual Spanish speakers and monolingual English speakers, but also monolingual native speakers, like that speak indigenous languages across Latin America. So that's the first tip, is like, get interpreters on retainer and make sure that that information is in your asks when you reach out to folks, that, like, get your ask translated by your interpreters so that it's clear, like, what you're looking for. So that when you send out an ask, it's in English and in Spanish, and then I can just forward it to an organizer. I can forward it to the right organization and get it in the right hands, without having to go to our interpreters. If you can't afford or don't have the ability to put interpreters on retainer in your own organization, make it clear in your ask that you are willing to take the time with an interpreter provided by us, because we all have interpreters on staff, like either on staff or on retainer, who are able to do these conversations because we're organizing them. Like, we have these folks, we have the ability to do so. So make it clear that you'll take the time, because it's like, if you want to reach folks and you don't have the language ability to do it, it's not going to be the same turnaround as if you, like, it's just going to take a little bit longer, and you have to have that patience and accept that that's a fact. And then lastly, if it's possible for you to reimburse our interpretation time because it's a favor to you, that would be another thing to throw in the thing, is like, hey, we don't have interpretation. We want to talk to Spanish speaking folks or indigenous language folks. We think you probably have relationships with folks who can. We'll reimburse your interpreter at whatever rate per hour. That's how you really can, that will burst open the doors of ability for folks to be able to talk to you, because we have the right people.
Nafisa, thank you so much for that. And I just wish to boost the comment from Ligia Navarro about turning to NAHJ as a resource. I did have a follow-up question. Can you talk about the need to be sensitive in terms of approaching sources who may have undocumented status, and tips on developing those relationships? In my experience, it's not just a one-off where you can just approach someone and get an interview and leave it at that. It's about building the relationship. So I'd appreciate your guidance on how best to do that.
Yeah, I think this is where, building relationships on the ground in communities is very important, because especially in undocumented immigrant communities, we are always very wary of people coming in and really extracting from our communities to get our stories so that you can amplify the whatever reporting that you're doing. I think talking to organizations on the ground that are doing this work is extremely important, because they already know and have the trust of the community, and they will vet it for their communities to see, what the reporter is looking for, and to see if it's a good fit, to make sure that, number one, if it's a good fit, number two is to ensure the safety of their community members, right? So you're talking about prior about asking for folks that Latina in communities. 9 to 5 also works with a huge Latinx constituents, right? But we are also very protective of the folks that we work with, because many of those that we work with and organize with in the communities are undocumented. So again, I said, look out for local organization, worker centers that are in communities, and talk to them first, and they will probably be able to guide you in the right direction.
Ashley, I just want to piggyback one other thing, and I may be reading into this conversation, but I hope that when we're talking about undocumented workers, that we're saying that broadly. I think the rhetoric would have us think that they tend to be, and I was getting ready to respond to Anna, that they tend to be Hispanic workers, and I avoid that term Latino, because generally that includes Brazilian, and that's not who we're generally talking about when we're talking about Latino, right? And also because I use census data. That we are mindful that there are Asian folks in the US who are undocumented, and there are African/Black folks in the US who are undocumented. So to me, that's another one of these in which, we're using the term undocumented, but we really don't mean undocumented. There's a particular population that we're talking about, and we're not thinking about that there are large groups, other groups, racial groups that are here undocumented and also being exploited.
Of course, Dr. Londa is correct. I'll just offer one more thing about talking to folks that are differently documented in or whatever ways. But is that if you're talking to this worker through an organization like Jobs with Justice or 9 to 5 or other worker organizations, United for Respect is on the call here too, almost certainly these organizations have taken the necessary precautions and prep with the worker before they even reach you. So you don't need, I'm not saying don't be cautious, but I'm saying that don't be afraid to be asking the questions that you want to be asking of this demographic of workers, because we have their backs and have done whatever we feel was we and they felt was appropriate to do the prep necessary. We may have already told you that we're not using real names, and we're not, we would have probably already set all that stuff up. So if you've gotten to a point already, where you've done all that and you're now talking to this worker that's undocumented, go full in, they're the expert, and throw away all the other stuff that you're carrying and the anxiety and all that other stuff. This is one of the things, it's a different type of white supremacy culture where it's you tread lightly because you're worried. At that point, just go all in, talk to them like an expert in the same way you would any other expert.
Well, we're just out of time. I want to thank you all so much for having this conversation. Ling Ling, Nafisa, Rhonda, I appreciate your time. If you'd like people to stay in touch with you, feel free to use the chat to include your website or your email on how people can reach out to you for any other questions they might have. And I want to kick things back over to Erica.
Thanks so much, Ashley. And thanks so much again to our panel and all the amazing conversation in the chat. We have a short break right now. We're also going to stop the recording for this panel. We'll start it back up for the next panel. So please get a drink of water, take a few minutes away from your desk, and we'll be back at the top of the hour for our next panel. So thanks again, everyone.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.